A desperate mother stepped off a dusty stagecoach with 2 children, one secret debt, and no guarantee the man waiting for her would be any kinder than the world she had escaped. Welcome to a powerful Western story about cowboys, frontier love, a mother's sacrifice, human kindness, and the healing power of compassion in a hard land. If you believe in stories with heart, please like, comment, share, subscribe, and stay until the last line.
The wind outside didn't just blow, it hunted. It cut down from the Bighorn Mountains, cold and sharp as a newly ground axe. Finding every loose seam in the pine logs of the cabin, Caleb Mercer didn't flinch. He was used to things trying to break into his house. He sat at the long oak table, a single kerosene lamp casting his shadow long and distorted against the timber wall. Before him lay the Cheyenne Daily Leader, 3 weeks out of date, its edges already yellowed by tobacco smoke and grease. His thumb, rough as sandpaper, traced a square he had carved out of the classifieds column with his pocket knife. On the table sat 2 chairs. He had bought the second one last November from a traveling merchant after his old stool split right down the grain. It was a good chair, sturdy spindleback ashwood oiled dark, but no one had ever sat in it. For 6 months, it had just faced the stove, holding nothing but the dry, heavy air of a house with only one heartbeat in it. Every morning, Caleb looked at that chair while his coffee boiled. Every morning, the silence inside it got a little louder. He hadn't broken yet, but he'd come close. Last Tuesday, a sudden freeze had trapped 8 of his prime heifers in a draw 3 miles out. By the time he dug them out, their lungs were solid ice. He had stood there in the gray twilight, his fingers too numb to drop the skinning knife, and realized something that curdled his blood worse than the frost. If his horse stumbled on the way back, if he lay down in the drift and let the sleep take him, nobody on goddess green earth would even think to look for him until the spring thaw. A man could survive on hard work. He could survive on salt pork and beans. But a man couldn't survive being a ghost while he was still breathing. He drew a clean sheet of foolscap paper toward him. His hand, thick-knuckled and scarred from 30 years of barbed wire, felt ridiculous holding a penny dip pen. He wrote 3 lines, stopped and watched the ink dry. He tore the paper in half. He tried again, wrote about the color of the grass in July, about the way the valley looked when the morning sun hit the ridges. He read it back, spat into the woodbox, and crumpled that sheet too. Poetry was a lie told by men who didn't have to work the dirt. It was the kind of talk that made a person soft, made them expect things the world had no intention of giving them. His mother had talked like that. She'd spoken of theaters and silk dresses and sidewalks that didn't turn to soup when the rain came. Then she climbed into the back of a dry goods drummer S-wagon and left a 12-year-old boy to figure out how to bury his father alone. Never need anyone enough that their departure can destroy you. That was the law, the only one that kept his ribs intact. The third attempt stayed on the paper. He didn't use any fancy ink. He just put down the facts, plain and heavy as iron fence posts. Broken Spur Ranch, 60 miles west of Ridgeline. Wyoming, 300 head of cattle, good water. Log house, sound roof, 4 rooms. I require a woman of good character and strong constitution, must know how to salt meat, bake bread, and handle a team if the weather turns. No dynamic required. This is an agreement for labor and upkeep. Caleb Mercer. He didn't ask if she was pretty. He didn't ask what church she gave her Sundays to. A pretty face didn't clear a ditch when the spring rise came, and piety didn't keep the wolves out of the calving pens. He needed an extra pair of hands. That was the trade. He sealed the letter in a brown envelope, addressed it to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis, and set it beside his hat. He didn't look at the empty chair across from him when he blew out the lamp. 700 miles to the east, the air didn't smell like pine. It smelled like coal smoke, horse manure, and the damp, sour rot of the Mississippi riverbanks. Margaret Cole sat on the edge of a sagging iron cot in a boarding house on 11th Street. The room was 4 paces wide. On the single mattress, 6-year-old Rose lay curled like a wintering grub, her thumb tucked tight into her mouth. her left arm slung over a tattered rag doll with a missing ear. On the floorboards beneath them, wrapped in a threadbare wool coat, 9-year-old Eli lay with his eyes wide open, staring at the water stains on the plaster ceiling. "Go to sleep, Eli," Maggie said. Her voice was low, flat, stripped of the music it used to have when she lived in the big brick house on Lafayette Avenue. "The floor's hard," the boy whispered. He didn't complain. He just stated it, the way an old man states the weather. He was growing up too fast, his face losing its soft childhood roundness, turning sharp and suspicious. He looked like Thomas around the eyes. That was the part that frightened her most. "Put the coat under your hip," she said. "It helps." On the small washstand, lit by a guttering tallow candle, 3 letters lay side by side. They were her options, her ledger of survival. She had read the first one twice. It was from a merchant in Iowa. He used 4 pages to describe the size of his store, the quality of his Sunday suits, and the elegance of his horse-drawn carriage. At the very end, he asked if she knew how to keep a kitchen clean, and noted that he preferred a woman who didn't speak unless spoken to. Maggie laid it down. Thomas had spoken like that. He had possessed a voice like melted butter and a wardrobe full of fine wool, and he had used both to hide the fact that he was drowning them in a $3,000 Kodak debt until the day the sheriff put the chain on their front gate. The second letter was from a farmer in Kansas. Every third word was God or scripture. He promised to guide her soul and discipline her children in the way of the righteous. Maggie pushed it aside. Men who spent that much time telling you how holy they were usually had a woodpile full of things they didn't want the neighbors to see. She picked up the third one. It was short. The ink was cheap, graying at the edges where the pen had run dry. "I require a woman of good character. This is an agreement for labor and upkeep." There was no talk of affection, no promises of a soft life. But near the bottom, right before the signature, there was a single sentence that none of the others had thought to include. "Can you describe the health of your children?" He didn't ask if they were quiet. He didn't ask if they would be a burden on his larders. He just wanted to know if they were healthy enough to stand the high country. Pragmatic, Maggie murmured to the dark room. She wasn't looking for a husband. She was looking for a fortress. Romance was a luxury for women who hadn't seen their furniture dragged into the street by a city marshal. She didn't need a man to love her. She needed a man who wouldn't leave her children starving in a cellar room. She reached under the mattress and pulled out a small, flat tin box. Inside was her past. A gold wedding band she hadn't been able to bring herself to pawn yet, a lock of Rose's baby hair, and a single sheet of blue paper with a legal seal. It was a demand notice from Victor Crane, 1/840 remaining on Thomas's notes. Crane wasn't a common street collector. He wore silk ties and carried his threats in clean envelopes. But he had 2 men with broken noses who stood on the corner of 11th Street every afternoon, watching the boarding house door. He knew she had the children. He knew she had no money left. And he had made it very clear what kind of payments once her rent ran out at the end of the month. She looked at the gray ink of Caleb Mercer's letter. Wyoming was far. It was wild, cold and empty. But Crane's reach stopped at the state line. And a man who asked about the health of her children before he asked about the width of her hips was a man she could deal with. "Eli," she said quietly. "Yeah, pack your boots in the crate tomorrow morning. We're leaving on the Tuesday coach." The boy didn't ask where. He didn't ask why. He just turned over on his side, his small shoulders tensing under the coat. "All right," he said. The weeks passed in a blur of dust, grease-grummy station biscuits, and the constant, rhythmic jolt of the Concord stagecoach. Maggie watched the green hills of Missouri flatten into the long, gray-brown swells of Nebraska, then rise again into the high, barren sagebrush of the Wyoming Territory. By the time the coach rumbled into Ridgeline, the children looked like they were made of trail dust. Rose's dress was gray with alkali, and Eli's lips were cracked and bleeding from the dry wind. The coach groaned to a halt outside the livery stable. The driver threw down the bags with a heavy thud, the mules stamping their feet in the dirt, their breath coming in long white plumes in the sharp June air. Maggie stepped out first. her hand gripping the doorframe to keep her knees from buckling. The air here didn't feel like air, it felt like thin ice. It hit the back of her throat, clean and sharp, making her lungs ache. She pulled Rose down beside her, the little girl clutching her doll so hard the fabric head was distorted. Eli climbed down without help, his small boots hitting the dirt with a solid slap. He didn't look at the town. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the horizon like a scout expecting an ambush. A man was standing by the corner of the dry goods store. He didn't move toward them. He just stood there, his hands tucked into his gun belt, a heavy canvas coat buttoned to his chin. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in dark shadow. But Maggie could see the gray in his beard and the hard, flat line of his mouth. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life fighting the wind and had won, but hadn't enjoyed the victory. Caleb Mercer watched the woman adjust her shawl. She was thinner than he'd expected, her face pale under the dust. But she didn't have the soft, drooping look of the city women he remembered. She stood straight, her chin up, her fingers steady as she held the little girl's hand. He looked at the boy. The kid was staring right back at him, his feet apart, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze steady as a surveyor's chain. Caleb took a slow breath, his chest rising against the stiff canvas of his coat. He walked forward, his boots crunching in the gravel. "Mrs. Cole," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel shifting in a bucket. "Mr. Mercer," she replied. Her voice didn't shake. That was good. He looked down at the two small wooden trunks by the coach wheel. "That all you brought?" "Everything we need," she said. Caleb nodded once. He didn't offer her his hand. He didn't tell her she looked well after the trip. He just reached down, picked up both trunks by their rope handles as if they weighed nothing at all, and swung them into the back of his spring wagon. "Get in," he said, nodding toward the high seat. "The wind's coming up from the north. We have 20 miles before dark." Maggie climbed onto the bench, her skirt rustling against the iron wheel. She didn't look back at the town. She didn't look back at the east. She looked at the long, empty road stretching out toward the mountains, gray and endless under the vast, pale sky. As Caleb climbed up beside her and took the reins, she reached down into her reticule, her fingers brushing against the heavy, sealed envelope from Victor Crane hidden in the lining. She had escaped the wolves in the city, but as the wagon rattled out into the sagebrush, the silence between them grew as wide as the territory, and Maggie wondered if she had simply traded one kind of danger for another. The wagon wheels didn't sing. They groaned. Every turn of the iron-rimmed oak against the limestone trail sent a shudder up through the floorboards, straight into Caleb Mercer's tailbone. He kept his eyes between the ears of his lead gelding, his hands loose on the leather reins. He didn't speak. The territory didn't require it, and the woman beside him didn't invite it. Margaret Cole sat with her spine away from the backrest. She held the seat rail with one gloved hand. Her leather shoes, scuffed gray from the platform at Ridgeline, were pressed flat against the floor. She smelled of train soot, old wool and something else, something dry and thin, like vinegar used to scrub a floor after the fever passed. In the bed of the wagon, behind the flour sacks and the crate of salt pork, the children were quiet. That was the part Caleb didn't know what to do with. Children from the valley usually made noise. They threw stones at the crows or whined about the grease on their fingers. These two just sat there. They were like two bags of oats left out in the rain, heavy, damp and perfectly still. The sun was dropping behind the freeze-out ridges when the road narrowed into the draw. The sagebrush grew thicker here, gray-green and woody, its roots sucking whatever spit of moisture the winter had left behind. "That's the line," Caleb said. He didn't point. He just shifted his chin toward a limestone bluff where 3 strands of rusted wire hung from a cedar post. "Broken Spur starts at the creek bed. What is left of it." Margaret turned her head. Her bonnet hissed against her collar. She looked at the wire. She looked at the dry sand where the water should have been running. "The wire is down," she said. "Cattle don't care about lines when they're thirsty," Caleb said. "They go where the smell is. A man spends half his life putting up wire, and the other half watching it rot. That's the first thing the country teaches you. Nothing stays where you put it. Some things do, she said. Caleb flicked the reins. The horses didn't quicken. They just lowered their heads and pulled. Only the rocks, he muttered. The house didn't look like much from the ridge. It was 4 rooms of square-hewn pine, the mud chinking between the logs cracking like dried meat. The roof was sod and cedar shake, weighted down with river stones so the spring gales wouldn't lift it off the plate. A lean-to barn stood 50 yards away, its door hanging by a single strap of rawhide. The horses stopped before Caleb pulled them up. They knew the hitching post like they knew their own stalls. Caleb got down. His knees made a dry, popping sound that sounded like a dry twig snapping. He didn't offer to help Margaret. A woman who came out here on a matrimonial ad didn't need a hand down from a 3-foot box. If she did, the first blizzard would have her in the ground before Christmas. She managed it herself. She caught her skirt on the brake lever, cleared it without a word, and landed in the dirt with both feet together. Her face was pale under the dust, but her mouth was a straight line. The boy, Eli, came over the side next. He didn't use the hub. He just dropped from the sideboard, his small boots hitting the earth with a hollow thud. He stood by his mother's hip, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, his eyes wide and dark as greasy bullets. The little girl remained in the wagon bed. She was holding that rag doll by its one good arm, her small face buried in the wool of her mother's spare cloak. "Rose," Margaret said. Her voice had a sharp edge to it now, like a knife that had been ground too many times. "Get down." The girl didn't move. Caleb walked to the back of the wagon. He reached over the tailgate, his large, square hands going under the child's armpits. She felt like nothing, a handful of dry grass and small bones. He lifted her out and set her on the grass. She didn't look at him. She just clung to the doll, her thumbs slipping into her mouth with a dry, clicking sound. Eli stepped into Caleb's path. He didn't look up at Caleb's hat. He looked right at his shirt pocket, where the brass button was missing. "Are you going to stay?" the boy asked. The wind took the words and carried them off toward the draw, but the silence they left behind was heavy. Caleb stopped with a sack of flour against his ribs. He looked down at the boy's nose. It was red from the wind. "What's that?" "The last man didn't," Eli said. "He didn't blink. He had 3 horses and a blue wagon. He said he was going to stay until the corn came up. Then he went away in the night." "Eli," Margaret said, her voice dropping an octave. Caleb didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the boy. "This isn't corn country," he said. "Corn needs rain, and rain don't like Wyoming. I've been here 12 years. The house hasn't moved. The barn hasn't moved. If I go anywhere, it'd be under that ridge with a stone over my face. You want to know if there's bread tomorrow? Ask your mother. You want to know if the roof stays on? You ask me. That's the size of it." The boy chewed on his inside cheek. He didn't say he was satisfied, but he stepped back 3 inches. That was enough for Caleb. The kitchen inside was cold. It smelled of old grease, chicory coffee, and the pine oil Caleb had used to wipe down the table the night before. The stove was a 6-burner iron piece he'd hauled from the railhead at Laramie 5 years back. It was the only thing in the room that looked like it cost money. "The wood's in the box," Caleb said, setting the trunks by the door. "The water's in the barrel by the stoop. It's sweet water, but you have to boil it if the moss is high in the creek. I'll be in the barn until dark." Margaret looked at the table. She looked at the 2 chairs facing each other. "We'll need a third," she said. "There's a 3-legged stool in the lean-to." Caleb said from the door, "It needs a wedge in the tenon if you don't want to go over backward. I'll get to it when the horses are fed. I can wedge a chair." "Mr. Mercer," she said. Caleb paused. His hand was on the latch. He looked at her fingers. They were small, the nails trimmed short and clean, but the skin around the knuckles was red. "A loose wedge is worse than no wedge at all," he said. "It gives you a false sense of things being tight until you put your weight down. Everything out here has to be driven home till the wood groans. Remember that." He went out and shut the door. The latch made a heavy, iron clink that felt like a key turning in a lock. The supper was salt pork, fried hard till the fat ran clear, and cold biscuits from the Ridgeline Bakery. They ate in the gray light of a single candle. Caleb didn't light the lamp. Kerosene was 40 cents a gallon at Herschel's, and a man didn't waste oil on food he already knew the taste of. The children ate with their fingers, eyes darting around the log walls every time a timber creaked. When the plates were scraped, Caleb cleared his throat. He didn't look at the children. He looked right at the space between Margaret's eyebrows. "We'll put the terms down now," he said, "before the betting's laid." Margaret set her fork down. It made a sharp, silver sound against the tin plate. "Go on, I put it in the letter." "But letters are paper. Paper burns," Caleb said. He leaned his forearms on the table. They were thick as fence posts, covered in dark, coarse hair. "This is an arrangement. I don't expect you to be my mother, and I don't expect you to be a girl from a social. You keep the kitchen. You wash the wool. You handle the garden when the frost goes. I provide the house, the beef, and 2 suits of wool for the children every winter. There is no other dynamic here." The little girl, Rose, dropped her doll. It hit the floorboards with a soft, rag-stuffed thump. Eli picked it up instantly, his eyes jumping to Caleb's face like he expected a blow. Caleb didn't move. "I don't have soft words in me, Mrs. Cole. I had them once, and they didn't pay the interest on the note. I don't want you pretending you were glad to be here, and I won't pretend I'm glad to have 3 more mouths at the bacon. This is a trade." Margaret looked at the candle. The wick was splitting, the flame dancing in the draft from the floorboards. "That suits me," she said. Her voice was level, almost cold. "A man who talks about love usually wants something he hasn't paid for. I had my fill of beautiful words, Mr. Mercer. They don't keep the rain out." "Good," Caleb said. "But I have my own term," she said. She leaned forward now, her face coming into the small circle of yellow light. "You have the right to work my hands until they bleed. That's the trade. But you do not have the right to look at my children like they are strays from the brush. If they are in this house, they belong in this house. You don't tell them they re-eating another man's bread, and you don't make them feel small for needing a roof." Caleb's jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek twitched twice. He looked at Eli, who was watching him with that same hard, measuring look his father must have had when the cards were running bad. "A dog knows its own kennel," Caleb said quietly. "If they're here, they're here. I don't grudge a beast its corn if it pulls its weight." "They aren't beasts," she said. "Everything out here is a beast, Mrs. Cole," Caleb said, standing up so fast the table jarred. "Some of us just know the name of the tool we're using. The girl can sleep in the lean-to room behind the kitchen. The boy stays with you behind the canvas. I'll be in the loft above the horses." He didn't wait for her to answer. He took his hat from the peg, pulled it low until his eyes disappeared, and went out into the dark. The wind had died down, but the air was bitter now. Caleb walked across the hard-packed dirt of the yard, his boots making a regular, crunching rhythm. He didn't look at the stars. The stars were beautiful, but they didn't give a damn about the price of beef or the crack in a man's ribs. He climbed the ladder to the hayloft, his hands finding the smooth, grease-darkened rungs by feel alone. He lay down on the horse blankets, his boots still on, his coat buttoned to the chin, through the gaps in the floorboards. He could hear the geldings shifting in their stalls below. They blew through their noses, their big hooves stamping the straw. It was a good sound. Honest, a horse didn't tell you it liked you. It just pulled when you hit it with the leather, and it kicked when you got too close to its hocks. He lay there for 10 minutes, staring at the pitch-dark rafters. Then he heard it. It was a thin, whistling sound, coming from the house. A child's cry, but small, muffled by a hand or a blanket. It wasn't the boy. The boy wouldn't cry if you skinned him. It was the little one. Rose. Caleb sat up. The hay rustled under his hip. His shoulder hit a pine rafter, and a shower of dry bark fell into his hair. "Leave it," he told himself. "It's the woman's business. She's paid to handle the kitchen and the children." He lay back down. The crying went on. It didn't get louder, but it didn't stop. It was like water dripping from a bad flume, not enough to drown you, but enough to keep you from forgetting the wood was rotting. He swung his legs over the edge of the loft and found the ladder. He walked across the yard in his socks, the frost on the grass biting through the wool like small needles. He didn't open the door. He just stood by the log wall, near the corner where the lean-to room met the main house. He knocked once with his knuckle against the pine timber. It was a heavy, dull sound. "Mrs. Cole," he said, his voice low so it wouldn't carry across the flat. The crying stopped instantly. A pause, then the latch clicked, and the door opened 3 inches. Margaret stood there, her hair down now, looking long and dark against her white shift. She had a small sewing needle in her hand. "Is she sick?" Caleb asked. "She's as frightened," Margaret said. "The room is dark. She's not used to the logs." Caleb looked past her into the kitchen. The candle was out, but the stove door was open an inch, a red eye of coal glowing in the belly of the iron. "Tell her the logs don't move," Caleb said. "A house that creaks is just settling its weight. It's the ones that stay quiet you have to watch. That means the timber's dried out to the core, and the first big wind split the joints. If she hears the wood groaning, that means it's holding." Margaret looked at him. Her eyes were large in the shadows, catching the red reflection from the stove. "I'll tell her," she said, "and keep the stove door shut," Caleb added, his voice dropping into that flat, hard register. "Coal don't grow on the sagebrush. Every lump we burn now is a lump we don't have in November." She didn't answer. She just closed the door, slowly, until the iron clicked. Caleb stood on the porch for a minute, his feet turning numb in the frost. He looked out toward the ridge where his fence was down. The country was out there, huge and black and cold, waiting for him to make a mistake. He'd made one 12 years ago when he let his mother leave without saying her name. He wasn't going to make another. He walked back to the barn, his heels digging into the freezing mud, counting his steps until he reached the ladder. The third week of July brought the grasshoppers. They came from the south, small and green at first, then turning fat and yellow as they chewed through the wild hay in the bottoms. Caleb spent his mornings in the irrigation ditch with a shovel, clearing the silt that washed down from the cloudbursts in the hills. The water was low. It didn't flow so much as crawl, a thick brown tongue of mud that left a white crust of alkali on the banks when it receded. Margaret came down from the house at noon, carrying a tin pail of buttermilk and a loaf of rye bread wrapped in a damp cloth. She didn't wear her bonnet anymore. She wore an old straw hat she'd found in the loft, its brim tied down with a strip of blue calico to keep the wind from snapping it off. She set the pail in the shade of a willow bush. "The boy wants to help with the ditches," she said. Caleb didn't stop digging. He drove the spade into the gray clay, broke out a hunk the size of a beef head, and swung it onto the levee. He's too small for the shovel. He'll strain his back. And a strained back on a boy is like a warped sill on a barn. It never grows straight again. "He's stronger than he looks," she said, sitting on a flat stone by the water. "He hauled 2 barrels from the well this morning without spilling a drop." "Hauling is balance," Caleb said. He stopped, wiped his forehead with his sleeve, and leaned on the ash handle. His shirt was soaked through between the shoulder blades, the salt leaving white curves on the blue wool. "Ditching is leverage. You have to know where the weight of the water is before you lift the mud. If you don't, the clay will tear your shoulder right out of the socket." Let him stick to the wood box. He wants to learn the work. Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. attached. It sounded strange in the draw short, sharp like a rifle shot over the water. Caleb looked at her over the shovel blade. Her face had browned under the straw hat, the skin across her nose peeling in small, white flakes. She looked less like St. Louis every day. Her hands were on her apron, her fingers tucked into the folds to hide the blisters she got from the scrubbing board. "The work will be here when he has 20, Caleb said. "The land don't go anywhere. That's the beauty of it. It just waits for you to wear out. Then it takes your bones and uses them for lime." He took the buttermilk pail, pulled the wooden bung, and drank. It was sour and cold, the fat in it sticking to his mustache. He handed it back to her. Their fingers didn't touch. They had learned how to pass things knives. Plates the reins without their skin meeting. It was like a dance they'd both practiced in different rooms. "The neighbor's cattle were in the willow draw again," she said, looking down at the mud. The ones with the broad arrow brand. Caleb's mouth hardened. He set the spade down. Harlan-esque cows. A big red one with a broken horn, she said. The wild plum bushes by the spring. Eli threw rocks at it, but it didn't move until I brought the dog. Don't let the boy near Harlan's stock, Caleb said, his voice dropping into that low register that made the horses prick their ears. Wade Harlan's been looking for an excuse to find a dead heifer on my side of the wire for 3 years. If he finds one with a stone bruise on its hip, he have the marshal out here before the meat's cold. You see them cows again. You leave them be. I'll handle Harlan. He has a lot of wire, Margaret said. He has a lot of money. Caleb said. That S what buys wire. Money from the banks back east. He don't work the dirt. He pays men from Texas to do it for him. Men with low crowns on their hats and no names they care to use at the store. He picked up the shovel again. Go back to the house, Margaret. The wind's shifting. It's going to bring the dust off the flats. The tension didn't stay in the ditches. It followed them into the barn. On Tuesday afternoon, a 3-year-old filly Caleb was breaking, got her foot caught in the manger rail. She was a nervous thing, gray-coated and wild-eyed, with a skin so thin you could see the veins pulsing along her neck. When Caleb went into the stall with the sideline, she panicked. She threw her hindquarters against the log wall, her iron shoes striking the pine with a sound like pistol shots. Margaret was in the hallway, filling a grain sack from the bin. She didn't run. She stood there with the wooden scoop in her hand, her face perfectly still as the horse squealed. Get back, Caleb shouted, his shoulder pressed against the filly's hip, trying to force her off the rail before she snapped her cannon bone. She's going to clear the partition. The filly lunged. Her shoulder hit Caleb square in the ribs, knocking him backward into the dirt floor. His hat went into the manure, and for 3 seconds, the air wouldn't come into his lungs. It felt like his chest was full of broken glass. The horse was up on her hind legs now, her front hooves striking the air within 6 inches of his head. Then Margaret was there. She didn't use a whip. She didn't scream. She took the grain sack, the heavy, coarse burlap, and threw it right over the filly's eyes. The horse dropped her front feet. The dark took the fight out of her. She stood there, her breath coming in long, rattling gasps, her skin shaking like grass in a gale. But she didn't lunge again. Margaret didn't look at the horse. She dropped to her knees in the dirt beside Caleb. Her hands went to his shirt collar, tearing the brass button away to get to his throat. Can you breathe? She asked. Her voice was loud, her breath hot against his chin. Caleb managed a ragged gasp. The air came in, sour with the smell of the floor, but his ribs held. I am all right, he choked out. He tried to sit up, but her hand stayed on his chest, not soft, but heavy, pressing him down into the straw. Stay still, she commanded. A broken rib will pierce the lung if you twist too fast. My brother had it happen at the timber landing. He choked on his own blood before the doctor got the harness on the team. Caleb looked up at her. Her hat had fallen back, her hair coming loose from the calico strip, hanging in damp, dark ropes around her face. He could see the pulse in her throat, beating hard against the white skin. I said I'm all right, he muttered. He caught her wrist. Her wrist was small. He could have snapped it with his thumb and forefinger, but the bone felt dense, like seasoned hickory. They stayed like that for 4 seconds, Caleb on his back in the straw, his hand around her wrist. Her fingers pressed against his breastbone. The filly blew through her nose, the burlap sack slipping from her forehead onto the manger. Caleb let go of her arm. He rolled onto his left side, using the partition rail to haul himself up. His ribs screamed, but they didn't grate. She didn't break the leg, he said, looking at the horse's hock. That's the main thing. A horse with a broken leg is just 40 pounds of hide and a hole in the ground. Margaret stood up, brushing the straw from her apron with sharp, angry strokes. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline leaving her skin gray around the lips. Is that all you think about? The hide, that's what keeps the store bills paid, Caleb said. He picked up his hat, shook the chaff out of the crown, and pulled it down over his ears. A man who thinks about anything else out here spends his winters eating his own boots. I'm obliged to you for the sack. I didn't do it for you, she said, her voice turning hard again as she picked up her wooden scoop. I did it because if that horse killed you, I'd have to haul your body into town myself, and the wagon needs grease. She went down the hallway toward the kitchen, her shoes striking the packed dirt with that same regular, unyielding rhythm. That night, the house was so quiet you could hear the oil burning in the lamp. Caleb sat by the window, a piece of harness leather on his knee, his awl punching clean holes through the strap. Every time he pushed the steel through, his ribs twitched. But he didn't stop. A man who let his chores go because of a bruise was a man who'd be begging for flour by March. Eli sat on the floor by the woodbox, a piece of cedar and a small pocket knife in his hands. He wasn't whittling anything. He was just shaving the wood into thin, curly ribbons that smelled of turpentine. Eli, Caleb said. The boy didn't look up. The knife didn't stop. Yeah, you want to know how to use that steel? Caleb asked, pointing the awl at the pocket knife. You're holding the blade too high. You keep that angle. The edge will catch a knot and jump right into your thumb joint. A knife don't care if it's cutting wood or cutting meat. It just goes where the force is. The boy stopped. He looked at the blade. He looked at Caleb's hand, where the old scar from a skinning knife ran white across the knuckles. My dad had a knife with a silver handle. Eli said he used it to cut his tobacco. A silver handle don't make the steel any better, Caleb said. Usually means the manufacturer spent his money on the garnish because the temper in the iron was soft. You want a tool that works. You look at the spine. If it's thick enough to take the hammer, it'll take the stone. Eli looked down at his cedar stick. He lowered the back of the blade until it was almost flat against the wood, then drew it down. A long, perfect ribbon of red cedar curled over his thumb and fell into the box. He didn't say thank you. He just kept shaving. From the kitchen, the low, steady hum of Margaret's spinning wheel went on and on. A rhythmic whir-click that sounded like a clock ticking down the hours. Caleb looked at the second chair across the table. It was still empty, but through the canvas partition, he could see the shadow of the little girl's doll sitting on the shelf, its one-eared head tilted toward the light. He went back to his leather. The needle went in. The waxed thread followed, and out on the flats. A coyote gave its short, sharp bark to the moon. Caleb didn't look up. The wall was between him and the dark, and, for now, the wood was holding. The road into Ridgeline didn't have a tree to its name. It was just 10 miles of ruts cut into the alkali, white as flour and twice as dry. By the time the wagon hit the town limits, the dust had settled into the grease of the axle boxes, making them squeal like stuck pigs. Caleb pulled the team up outside Herschel General Store. He hitched the geldings to the iron rail with a double half-hitch, snapping the leather tight. You don't leave a horse loose in town, he said to Eli, who was watching from the seat. Not even a gentle one. A stray dog or lapping newspapers all it takes. A horse doesn't think about tomorrow. It thinks about right now. And if right now looks dangerous, it'll run through a storefront to get away from it. Remember that. The boy nodded. He climbed down, his small boots disappearing into the white dust of the street. Margaret adjusted her shawl. She'd spent the morning brushing her gray wool dress, but the trail had won anyway. She had a line of white dust across her cheekbone that looked like grease paint. Her chin was up, though it was always up when she neared the town. The interior of Herschel smelled of brine, dried apples, and unwashed wool. It was dark after the glare of the flats. Herschel sat behind the counter, his spectacles hanging by a cord around his fat neck. He didn't move when the latch clicked. He just shifted his plug of tobacco from his left cheek to his right. Mercer, the storekeeper said. Herschel, Caleb replied. He set his grocery list on the counter. I need 50 pounds of salt flour, a firkin of lard, and 3 boxes of centerfire cartridges, the 44s. Herschel looked over his glasses at Margaret. He didn't take his hat off. Here you took a wife. Caleb, didn't think you had the coin for the matrimonial fees. The fees are paid, Caleb said. His voice was flat as a pine board. The paperwork's at the county seat. The flour. Herschel, at the back of the store, near the bolts of calico. 3 women were sitting on the low benches. One of them was Margaret Ames. Her husband owned the bank that held the mortgage on and 2/3 of the water rights along the Chugwater. She had an unspotted straw bonnet and fingers that had never seen a lye bucket. The women stopped talking when Margaret Cole walked toward the dry goods side. The silence in the store got thin, like the ice on a stock tank in October. Mrs. Ames stood up. She didn't approach. She just drifted, her silk skirts making a dry hiss-hiss against the floorboards. Mrs. Mercer, the banker's wife said. The name came out of her mouth like she was tasting sour milk. We were wondering when Caleb would bring you in. The town has been curious. Margaret Cole stopped by a pile of heavy denim overalls. She didn't lower her eyes. There isn't much to see. Mrs. Ames, dust and hard work look the same on everyone. I suppose they do, Mrs. Ames said, her eyes traveling down Margaret's sleeve to the frayed cuff where the braid had come loose, though some are more accustomed to it than others. I remember Thomas Cole. He came through Cheyenne 5 years ago on a legal matter for the railroad. A very elegant man. He had a gold watch chain that could have hitched a team. Margaret didn't blink. Her left hand went into the fold of her apron, her fingers tightening until the skin across her knuckles went yellow. An elegant man isn't always a useful one, Mrs. Ames. A gold chain doesn't hold a roof against the wind. No, the banker's wife said, her voice dropping into a sweet, poisonous register. But it usually means the bills are paid. My husband tells me there are still inquiries coming from the capital regarding Mr. Cole's estate. It must be a relief to be out here in the sagebrush, where the law takes so long to ride. Caleb stood by the flour scale. He heard every word. His hand went to his pocket knife, his thumb tracing the brass bolster. Not your fight, the voice inside him said. It's a transaction. You paid for her hands, not her past. He looked at Eli. The boy was standing by the pickle barrel, his small shoulders hunched, his face dark with a look that belonged on a 30-year-old gambler. He knew what Mrs. Ames was doing. He'd seen it before, in the parlors of St. Louis when the money ran out. Caleb didn't speak. He took his 50-pound sack of flour, swung it over his shoulder, and walked past the women out to the wagon. He didn't look back to see if Margaret was following. The ride home was longer than the ride in. The sun was right in their eyes, red and hot, cooking the grease on the harness leather until it smelled like a dead hide. Eli sat in the back with the cartridges, his thumb clicking the box lid open and shut. Click, snap, click, snap. Stop that, Caleb said without turning around. You wear the hinge out on a cardboard box. The grease gets into the primers. A damp primer means a misfire when you're relooking at a wolf. A tool you don't take care of will always fail you at the exact moment you need it to work. That's the rule. The boy stopped. The silence came back, heavy and sour with the smell of horse sweat. Those women didn't like my mother, Eli said from the bed. Town women don't like anything they didn't buy themselves, Caleb said. They look at a woman who works the dirt and they see what they be if their husbands didn't have a safe full of greenbacks. It frightens them. So they use their tongues like knives to see if the skin's as tough as it looks. Margaret sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at him. You didn't say anything, Mr. Mercer. I don't waste lead on crows, Caleb said. You talk back to a woman like Margaret Ames. You give her something to chew on until next court day. You keep your mouth shut. She's just barking at the wind. The wind don't care about the bark. Sometimes, Margaret said, her voice small and tight against the rattle of the wheels. The bark hurts anyway. Caleb flicked the lines over the gelding's rumps. Out here, Margaret. If it don't leave a scar that stops the muscle from working, it don't count as hurt. You remember that. And the town won't ever touch you. The sun was gone when they reached the home creek. The cabin looked small under the great shadow of the bluff, a square block of dark logs against the gray sage. Caleb unhitched the team in the dark, his fingers working the buckles by habit. He was carrying the harness into the lean-to when Dot Pierce rode into the yard on her gray mule. Dot was 60, her face like an old boot that had been left in the creek and dried in the sun. She wore a man's coat and rode astride, her stirrups short to accommodate her bad hips. She didn't get down. "Mercer," she said. Caleb stopped by the door. "Dot," the mule slathered. "He is old," she said, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Like me, I went by the boarding house after you left Herschel's. There was a fellow there from the stage. Wore a hard hat and city shoes. Said his name was Crane." Caleb didn't move. The harness in his hand felt heavy, the iron hames cold against his palm. "What's he want in Ridgeline?" "He don't want the scenery," Dot said. She looked toward the cabin window, where Margaret's candle had just flickered to life. "He had a legal ledger under his arm, and he was asking Herschel where the broken spur line started. Said he's had some paperwork to deliver to the widow of Thomas Cole." Caleb didn't say anything for a long time. The gray mule stamped its foot, the bit chains clinking in the dark. "He's legal?" Dot Caleb asked. "He looks legal." Dot said, "That's the dangerous kind. A man with a gun you can shoot back at. A man with a piece of paper can take your well before you know the well's dry. I thought I'd let you know. I don't like Harlan." "And Harlan was sitting on the porch with him when I left." "Harlan," Caleb repeated. "They were drinking Herschel's whiskey out of the same bottle," Dot said. She turned the mule around with a yank of the single rein. "You watch your wire. Caleb, a wolf don't ever come at the sheep from the side they're looking at." She rode out of the yard, the mule's hooves making a slow, steady plip-plop in the dust until the dark took her. Caleb stood in the doorway of the barn for 5 minutes, his ribs aching where the filly had hit him. He looked at the cabin window. The yellow light was steady, casting a long, straight beam across the dirt yard. It looked like a path. But he knew better. A path went both ways, and Caleb Mercer had spent 12 years making sure his road only went out. The morning brought no wind. That was the bad sign. When the sagebrush didn't move in Wyoming, it meant the heat was building up in the draws like steam in a boiler, waiting for the afternoon clouds to break it wide open. Caleb was in the blacksmith shop behind the barn, heating an iron tire for the wagon wheel. The charcoal fire was white hot, the hand bellows groaning every time he pulled the lever. He heard the buggy before he saw it. A light rig, iron-tired, pulled by a rented livery horse that didn't know how to walk in the ruts. Caleb didn't drop his tongs. He stepped out of the shed, the red-hot iron hoop still smoking in his grip. The man in the buggy wore a black wool suit that hadn't seen any trail dust until today. He had a hard, round bowler hat pulled straight over his ears and a face as clean and white as a fresh-peeled turnip. He looked about 45, the age where a city man gets thick around the middle from sitting in chairs that have cushions on them. He pulled the horse up 10 feet from the forge. He didn't get out. "Caleb Mercer?" the man asked. His voice was high, sharp like a lawyer's clerk reading a roll. "I am," Caleb said. He didn't lower the tongs. The heat from the iron ring was cooking the skin on his forearm, but he didn't flinch. "You re on private land." "Mister, my name is Victor Crane," the man said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a long, blue envelope with a red wax seal. "I am the legal representative for the Great Lakes Credit Syndicate of Chicago. I am looking for Margaret Cole. There's no one here by that name," Caleb said. The cabin door opened. Margaret came out onto the porch, her apron gray with flour. Rose behind her clutching the one-eared doll. Eli came around the corner of the house, a split piece of pine in his hand, his eyes fixed on the city man's boots. Crane looked past Caleb at the porch. He took his hat off, his hair short and oiled flat to his skull. "Mrs. Cole," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced rhythm. "Or should I say Mrs. Mercer? The county records in Ridgeline are remarkably up to date for such a remote settlement." Margaret didn't answer. She walked down the 3 steps, her feet heavy in the dirt, until she stood 3 paces behind Caleb's left shoulder. "You re a long way from 11th Street, Mr. Crane. The syndicate has a long memory." "Madam," Crane said. He swung his legs out of the buggy, his shiny leather shoes sinking 2 inches into the alkali dust. He didn't like the feel of it. He shifted his weight twice to find a solid stone. "Your late husband's estate was short by $3,200. We managed to liquidate the house on Lafayette Avenue, but the legal fees and the interest remain. The balance is $1,840. Thomas is dead, Margaret said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't shake. He's been in the ground 6 months. You took the beds, Crane. Took the kitchen stove. You left my children sleeping on the floorboards. The law doesn't die with the debtor, Mrs. Mercer, Crane said. He held out the blue envelope. He didn't offer it to her. He offered it to Caleb. And under the statutes of this territory, a husband assumes the liabilities of the wife upon completion of the marriage contract. This is a lien against the land and the stock of the Broken Spur Ranch. Caleb didn't take the paper. He let the tongs drop. The iron tire hit the dirt with a dull thud, the red glow dying instantly as the alkali choked the heat out of it. "Let me see that," Caleb said. He took the envelope. His fingers left black grease marks on the clean linen paper. He read the lines, the legal terms, the descriptions of his land, the numbers cut into the margin. At the very bottom, beneath the judge's signature, was another name written in a big, looping hand. Wade Harlan, witness and co-holder. Caleb looked up at Crane. His eyes were small, like two holes poked in a leather hide. "Harlan bought this note. Mr. Harlan is a major shareholder in our regional operation," Crane said, adjusting his collar. "He has an interest in seeing the credit of this valley kept clean. He has suggested a compromise. The eastern pastures, the ones along the Chugwater where the spring stays green, would be sufficient to clear the balance of the note. We can sign the deed transfer in town tomorrow." The silence came back, bigger this time, filling the yard until the heat seemed to double. Caleb turned his head slowly. He looked at Margaret. She wasn't looking at Crane. She was looking at Caleb's boots, her jaw tight, her chest rising and falling beneath the gray wool. "You knew about this," Caleb said. "It wasn't a question." "I knew Thomas owed money," she said, her voice dropping so low the city man couldn't have heard it over the hoarse breathing. "I didn't know they could touch the land out here. I didn't know about Harlan. You brought a $3,000 debt to a ranch that doesn't clear $500 a year in prime beef," Caleb said. His voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a dog crawl under the porch. "You lied in the letters. Margaret, I told you I had 2 children and no money," she said, looking up now, her eyes dark and fierce as his own. "I didn't lie about that. I came to the only place that had a door that would open. If I stayed in the city, Crane would have had my kids in the asylum by winter. I did what I had to do to keep them out of the ditch. Through my wire," Caleb said. Crane cleared his throat, a sharp paper dry sound. "Gentlemen and lady, the legalities are quite clear. The note is valid. If we go to the circuit court in Laramie, the costs will simply be added to the principal. Mr. Harlan's offer is very generous." Caleb walked over to the buggy. He didn't look at the paper anymore. He looked at Crane's tie pin, which was a small blue stone set in silver. He reached out, took the livery horse by the bit ring, and turned the animal's head 45 degrees toward the road. "You have 10 minutes to get past my wire," Caleb said to the city man. Crane blinked. His hand went to his waistcoat pocket. "Mr. Mercer, I am an officer of the credit court out here," Caleb said, his forearm tense against the horse's jaw. "The only court that stays open past sundown is the one I keep in my holster. You tell Wade Harlan that if I see his enforcers within rifle shot of my springs, I won't use the law to move them. I'll use 30 grains of black powder and a lead ball. Now get off my land before the iron gets cold." He released the bit. The livery horse, sensing the heat from the forge, reared back once and started down the trail at a clumsy trot. Crane had to grab the seat rail with both hands to keep his bowler from flying into the sagebrush. The dust cloud followed the buggy until it cleared the ridge. Caleb didn't look at Margaret. He walked back into the blacksmith shop, picked up his tongs, and threw the cold iron tire back into the coals. He took the bellows lever and began to pump, his strokes short, rhythmic and tattered as an old lung. Whir groan. Whir groan. Margaret stood in the doorway of the shed. The light from the forge hit her apron, turning the flour dust pink. "Caleb," she said, "go back to the house," he said without looking up from the fire. "The bread's going to sour if the dough sits too long in the heat." "We need to talk about the note," she said. Caleb stopped the bellows. He stood there in the smoke, his face black with charcoal, his eyes looking like two quart stones in a creek bed. "There's nothing to talk about, Mrs. Cole," he said, using the old name like a slap. "We had an agreement. Labor and upkeep. You didn't say nothing about legal liens. And I didn't say nothing about paying for a dead man's cards. You kept that envelope under your mattress because you knew I'd have left you on the platform if I saw it." "Yes," she said. She didn't flinch. "I did, because a man who lives by himself in a box doesn't know what it's like to look at two kids who haven't had meat in 3 weeks. You would have left us, Caleb, and I'd have had my eastern pastures in the spring," he said. He picked up the hammer from the anvil. "I'm going to sleep in the barn tonight. Tell the boy to keep the woodbox full. The weather's going to break before morning, and a cold stove makes the timbers warp." She stayed in the door for a minute, her shadow long and dark across his forge. Then she turned and walked toward the cabin, her steps small and heavy in the alkali, leaving him alone with the iron and the smoke. The heat didn't leave the valley at sundown. It stayed in the gray clay, thick and greasy, coming up through the soles of Caleb's boots like steam from a kettle. By the first week of August, the chugwater had shrunk to a string of warm puddles. The mud in the bottoms was baked so hard it split into gray cakes, 5 inches deep, wide enough to trap a calf's hoof and snap the bone like dry kindling. Caleb stood by the home tank, his thumb pressing against the bottom stave of the cedar barrel. The wood had shrunk. A thin trickle of gray water was hissing out through the joint, disappearing into the dust before it could form a pool. "A dry barrel is a dead barrel," he said to Eli, who was leaning against the pump handle. "You let the water drop below the line. The sun takes the moisture right out of the grain. Once the stave warps, you can hammer the hoops until the iron splits. But it'll never hold brine again. You have to keep the wood wet, even when the well's low." The boy looked into the dry tank. His face was dark from the glare, his nose peeling in white scales. "There ain't enough to fill it," he said. "Then you bring the bucket from the spring," Caleb said. "2 gallons at a time. It don't look like much against a 100-gallon tank, but the dirt don't care about big gestures. It only understands the small ones. Done every day. That's how you keep an orchard alive. And that's how you keep a ranch from turning back into a buffalo wallow." Eli didn't argue. He took the cedar bucket by its rope handle and started down the draw, his boots making a dry, whispering sound in the parched wild alfalfa. Caleb went up to the porch. He didn't want to go inside, but his ribs were stiff from the blacksmithing, and the sun was cooking the fat on his neck. Margaret sat at the table. She had the big leather ledger open between her elbows, her pencil tracing the columns he put down 5 years ago. She didn't look up when the screen door slammed. "The flour's down to the last 10 pounds, she said. Her voice had the flat, level tone of a woman counting sheep. "And the sugar's got ants in it from the cellar wall. Put the legs of the sugar box in tin cups of water," Caleb said, sitting on the bench by the stove. "The ants won't cross the ditch. That's the first thing my father learned when he brought the wagon across the Platte. A pest don't have much brain, but it knows when it's going to drown. We owe Herschel $16 for the lard," she said, her pencil tapping the page. "Tap, tap, tap. And the interest on the Laramie note is due on the 15th. $32.40. I have the cattle," Caleb said. "Harlan's men are riding the high ridge," she said, looking at him now. Her eyes were large, gray and clear as creek ice. "Eli saw them yesterday from the timberline. 3 of them. They had a pack horse and 2 rolls of smooth wire." Caleb's hand went to his chin, his beard rough against his palm. "Smooth wire don't hold nothing but horses. It don't have the teeth for cattle. They aren't putting it up for the cows," Margaret said. "They're rerunning a line from the Chugwater Spring down to the county road. If they close that gap, your steers have to walk 8 miles through the rocks to get a drink. They lose 40 pounds a head before they hit the shipping pens." Caleb stood up. His chair didn't scrape. It hit the wall with a dull, heavy click. "That spring's on my deed. The deed says the quarter-section line runs from the cottonwood stump to the limestone face," she said, her finger pointing at a blue map she found under the Bible box. "The stump rotted out 3 winters ago, Caleb. Thomas used to say that a boundary without a living marker is just an argument with a lawyer's name on it. Harlan knows the town won't send a surveyor out here for $32. Caleb walked over to the table. He looked at her finger. It was small. The skin around the nail rough, but it was rock steady on the map. You speak like a clerk, he said. I lived with one for 10 years, she said, closing the book with a heavy puff of dust. He wasn't much for a shovel, but he knew how a piece of paper could take a house out from under a woman while she was cooking breakfast. I spent 3 months watching men in black coats count the spoons in my drawer, Mr. Mercer. I know what a line looks like when it's drawn by a pen. Caleb leaned over the table. His shadow fell over her face, dark and broad as a barn door. Why didn't you stay there? If you knew the law so well. Because the law don't feed you, she said. She stood up too, her face within 6 inches of his beard. She didn't look down. It just tells you why you hungry. I wanted a place where the work mattered more than the signature. But you risk busy keeping your rule. Caleb, you can't see that Harlan's using your own loneliness to squeeze the life out of this creek. My rule kept me alive, he growled. It kept you alone, she said. That's not the same thing. A dead pine tree stays standing for 20 years, but it don't leave no seed in the dirt. She took the flour bin and went into the pantry, the wood door shutting between them with a sharp, clean snap. The cloudburst hit at 3 o'clock. It didn't start with a drizzle. It started with a roar in the hills, the sky turning the color of a greasy kettle before it opened up. The rain didn't fall. It drove horizontal and hard as birdshot, tearing the last green leaves off the cottonwoods. Caleb was in the corral when the ditch broke. The wall of water came down the draw, 2 feet high, carrying dead sagebrush, old bones, and the fence posts from the eastern line. The steers began to mill, their big sides bumping against the pine rails, their horns clashing with a sound like dry firewood breaking. Get them into the upper field, Caleb shouted to Eli, who was shivering under a piece of canvas by the shed. The gate opened the top latch. The boy ran into the mud, his boots slipping in the red clay. He reached for the cedar pole, but the weight of the water was already against the lower rail. The gate was jammed. Caleb started across the yard, but his boots caught in the wash. He went down on his knees, the cold water rushing over his thighs, the rocks bruising his shins through the leather. Then Margaret was there. She had her gray wool dress tucked into her belt, her bare legs red from the mud. She didn't try to lift the pole. She took Caleb's broadaxe from the chopping block and swung it 3 times against the cedar hinge. The wood split with a loud crack, and the gate went down into the wash, the steers rushing through the gap toward the high ground like gray water out of a flume. Caleb got to his feet. He was shaking from the cold, his shirt clinging to his ribs like a wet skin. He walked over to where she stood, the axe still in her hand, her hair plastered to her skull by the rain. The axe is ruined, he said, pointing at the nick in the steel blade where she hit a gravel stone in the log. You don't strike iron with a splitting tool. It takes the temper out of the center grain. Margaret looked at the axe. She looked at the cattle, who were already standing safe on the limestone ridge above the water. The steers are alive, she said, her breath coming short and white in the cold air. An axe can be ground on the stone. Caleb, a dead steer don't grow another hide. Caleb looked from the tool to her eyes. They were dark with the storm, but there was a light in them that wasn't there when she got off the stagecoach. It was the look of a person who had fought the country and found out she had teeth of her own. Get the little one, he said, his voice dropping into that flat, quiet register. The cabin roof's going to leak by the chimney if the mud chinking gives way. We need the tins under the rafters. I already put them there, she said, turning toward the house. Before the first clap came. I know when a storm's got weight in it. Caleb stood in the mud for a minute, the rain running down his neck. He looked at the split gate. He looked at the ridge. For 12 years, he'd been the only man on the broken spur who knew how to handle a crisis. He prided himself on it. But as he picked up the ruined axe, he realized the wood didn't feel as heavy as it used to. The mud dried in 48 hours, leaving the road to Ridgeland white and cracked like an old plate. Caleb rode the bay gelding in alone on Thursday morning. He didn't take the wagon. A man on a horse could move faster if he met someone on the wire line he didn't care to talk to. He stopped outside Pierce boarding house. The gray mule was tied to the porch post, its head down, its eyes half closed against the flies. Dot was on the porch, a tin of boiling water between her knees, plucking a scalded chicken. The smell of wet feathers was heavy in the damp air. "Mercer," she said without looking up. Her thumb ripped a handful of white down from the breast. "You look like you've been dragged through a flume." "The ditch broke," Caleb said, staying in the saddle. "Harlan S. men are running wire across the Chugwater Spring." Dot spat a brown stream of tobacco into the rose bushes. "They run it yesterday. Crane was with them. He had a big leather book with a gold stamp on it. Said the Territory Supreme Court gave them the writ of attachment." "A writ don't give a man a right to my water," Caleb said. "It does if the sheriff's the one holding the paper," Dot said. She set the chicken down in the basin with a splash that turned the water gray. "Cole Dunbar's a good man, Caleb, but he don't own the office. The banker Ames pays the rent on the jail, and Ames is Harlan's second cousin by marriage. You go down there with a Winchester. You ain't fighting Harlan. You refighting the territory." Caleb's fingers tightened on the reins until the bay horse shifted its bits. "Where is Dunbar now?" "He says at the saloon," Dot said, "having his dinner. He don't like Crane any more than you do, but a man with a tin star has to follow the ink. Go talk to him, but leave the rifle in the scupper, Caleb. A gun in a saloon just makes every fool in the room think he's got a say in the matter." Caleb rode down the block. He didn't leave the rifle, but he left it under the leather scabbard by his stirrup fender, where it couldn't be seen from the boardwalk. The interior of the Gold Room saloon was cool and dark, smelling of stale beer, sawdust, and the wet wool of two teamsters sleeping by the billiard table. Sheriff Cole Dunbar sat in the corner booth, a plate of boiled beef and cabbage before him. He was 50, with a white mustache that looked like a piece of sheepskin and eyes that had seen too many men die for $20 and a horse. Caleb sat down opposite him without asking. Dunbar didn't stop eating. He cut a piece of fat off the beef with his horn-handled knife. "Mercer," he said, "you have the writ." "Cole?" Caleb asked. The sheriff laid his knife down. It made a dull, greasy sound against the oilcloth table. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded paper with a blue seal. It looked exactly like the one Crane had shown Caleb at the forge. "It says legal, Caleb," Dunbar said. His voice was low, tired, like a horse that had been ridden 30 miles over the rimrock. "The Chicago firm filed the claim under the widow's name. Since she's on your deed now, the debt lies against the land. Harlan paid the back taxes on the Chugwater quarter last Monday. That gives him the primary lien if the estate don't clear by the 15th. The Chugwater is the only water I got after July," Caleb said. "Without it, the cattle die in the pens. I know that," Dunbar said, "and Harlan knows it. That's why he bought the paper from Crane. He don't want the $1,800. Caleb, he wants the broken spur. He's been waiting for you to trip over a dry winter for 10 years. "I didn't trip," Caleb said. "She brought it with her." Dunbar looked at him, his gray eyes narrowing under his heavy brows. "You took the woman, Mercer. A man don't just take the grain out of the sack. He takes the weevils too if he don't look before he buys. You wanted a hand in the kitchen, and you got a Chicago lawsuit. That's the size of it." "I can pay the taxes," Caleb said. "Can you pay the 1,800? Dunbar asked. He leaned forward, his badge catching the greasy light from the window. "Because Harlan won't take a partial payment. The writ says the balance must be paid in full at the county seat by noon on the 15th, or the deed reverts to the primary shareholder." "That's Harlan." Caleb stood up. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out into the glare of the street, his boots heavy on the pine planks of the boardwalk. He was passing Herschel S. store when Margaret Ames came out, followed by 2 women from the church guild. They were carrying small baskets of dried plums and jars of jelly for the social. Mrs. Ames stopped when she saw Caleb bay horse. She adjusted her lace mitts, her chin rising 3 inches into her bonnet. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice clear enough to carry across the dust to the blacksmith shop. "We were just discussing your arrangement. My husband tells me the lawyers from Laramie will be out on Friday to take the inventory of your stock." Caleb stopped. He didn't take off his hat. He stood in the middle of the boardwalk, his hands tucked into his belt, looking down at her lace collar. "There won't be no inventory, Mrs. Ames," he said. The women behind her whispered, their fans moving like the wings of prairie chickens in the brush. "The law is the law," Mrs. Ames said, her mouth turning into a thin line. "A man cannot simply take a woman from the street and expect the community to forget what her family owes. St. Louis may be far, but the moral obligation remains." Caleb took a step closer. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the gold watch chain pinned to her bosom, the same kind of chain Thomas Cole had worn when he was spending money that didn't belong to him. "You talk about the community, Mrs. Ames," Caleb said, his voice dropping into that flat, iron register that made the ladies stop their fans. "But I don't see none of you out in the draw when the water's red with silt. I don't see your husband holding the axe when the gate goes down. Margaret Cole's been in this valley 3 weeks, and she's done more for the Broken Spur than all the bank ledgers in Cheyenne. If you want the stock, you bring Harlan and his Texans out to the line, but you tell them to bring their own spades, because the ground's too hard for me to bury them all after the shooting starts." The women gasped, one of them dropping her jar of jelly onto the planks, where it broke with a loud, red splash that looked like blood in the white dust. Caleb turned his horse around and mounted. He didn't look back at them. He rode past the boarding house, past the livery, straight out toward the sagebrush, where the road turned into the gray hills. When he reached the home gate, the sun was dropping behind the big horns, turning the ridges the color of an old bruise. Margaret was on the porch, a wool dress over her arm, her needle moving through the hem by the last light. Rose sat beside her, her small hand smoothing the dress fabric as it fell into her lap. Caleb got down from the bay. His joints were stiff, his shoulder aching where the filly had bruised the muscle. But he walked up the steps with his head up. "Did you see Dunbar?" she asked. "I saw him," Caleb said. He took his hat off and set it on the bench. "The note is valid. Margaret, Harlan has got the papers from the court. He's coming on the 15th with the lawyers." She laid her needle down. Her fingers were steady, but her face looked small and old in the twilight. "I'll pack the trunks," she said. "No," Caleb said. She looked up, her eyebrows coming together. "Caleb, there's no money for the 1800. If we stay, he'll have the sheriff out here with the Winchester." "The sheriff don't like Harlan," Caleb said. He sat down on the bench beside her hat, his big hands folding over his knees. "And the town don't like a man who uses a city lawyer to steal a well. I told Margaret Ames today that if Harlan wants the dirt, he has to come get it himself. And she went and told her husband before the jelly was cold." Margaret Cole looked at him for a long time. The night wind was coming up from the creek, bringing the smell of the wet willow bushes and the fresh-turned clay from the ditch. "You broke your rule, Caleb," she said softly. Caleb looked out over the flats where his cattle were dark spots against the gray sage. "A rule is like a fence, Margaret," he said. "It keeps the stock in. But if you don't never open the gate to let the neighbors help when the fire comes, you just end up burning in your own corral. We go to town tomorrow, together, with the ledger." She didn't say she was glad. She didn't thank him. But she reached down and picked up Rose's doll from the floor, smoothing its one cloth ear with her thumb until the fabric lay flat. "The ledger is up to date," she said. "I found 3 mistakes in Herschel's columns from last winter. He owes you $12 for the hides you brought in November." Caleb's mouth twitched at the corner. $12 don't pay the 1800, he said. "No," she said, standing up and opening the screen door. "But it buys the sugar and the oil for the lamp. And out here, Mr. Mercer, you don't look at the size of the mountain until you've cleared the gravel out of your own shoe." She went in, and the kitchen lamp flickered once before it burned bright, casting 2 shadows through the window onto the dark timber yard. The heat didn't care about the calendar. By the 2nd week of August, the sun was just an iron plate in the sky, baking the ridge until the pine needles turned to powder under a man's heel. Caleb found the boy by the old line cabin, 3 miles from the home wells. Eli was sitting on the tongue of a broken hay rake, his pocket knife out, his eyes fixed on the gray gelding he'd hitched to the fence rail. The horse was a 4-year-old named Gerald. He had a white stripe down his nose and a habit of biting the wood when he was bored. He wasn't a gentle horse. He was just lazy until he saw something he didn't like, and then he'd kick the spokes out of a wheel before you could find the brake. "You're too far from the house," Caleb said. He didn't get down from the bay. He just let his leg hang over the stirrup leather. His hat pulled low against the glare. Eli didn't look up. He closed the knife with a sharp click against his thigh. Gerald didn't buck. He didn't buck because he's hot, Caleb said. A horse in August is like a lazy man. He look like a saint until the wind drops, and then he'll find a way to leave you in the dirt. How long you been riding him? 3 weeks, the boy said. He stood up, his small hands going into his pockets. He had the same hard, narrow look around the mouth his mother had when she was thinking about the flour bin. He don't like the bit. No horse likes the iron, Caleb said. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the dry wild oats. But they take it because they know the man's got the grain. You want a beast to follow you. Eli, you don't use the leather until he's done something wrong. You use the hand. A horse can feel a fly on his hip through an inch of hair. He knows exactly how much weight you got behind your fingers before you pull the rein. He walked over to Gerald, took the cheek strap, and pried the animal's jaws apart. The teeth were long, yellow and sharp as flint. He's nipping because the spade bit's hitting his bars. Caleb said, "Look here, see that red skin by the tush? That's where the steel rubs when you hold the lines too tight." A city man thinks he's holding a horse up by pulling on his head. A real rider knows the horse holds him up. You let the mouth go loose until you need the turn. Then you give him an inch of signal, just an inch. Eli came closer. His boots were gray with the alkali dust, the soles worn thin at the heel. He looked at the horse's mouth, then at Caleb's fingers. "My dad didn't ride like that. Your dad lived where the streets had stone on them," Caleb said. "A town horse has a soft life and a hard mouth. Out here, if a horse has a hard mouth, you'll find yourself at the bottom of a coulee with your neck broke before the sun goes down. The country don't leave no room for mistakes with the leather." The boy chewed his inside lip. He reached out and touched Gerald's nose, his small fingers steady against the white stripe. "Why you teaching me?" Caleb stopped. He looked at the ridge where Harlan's wire was waiting. "Because you're here," he said. "And a man who don't know how to handle his stock is just a burden on the kitchen. This ranch needs people who can ride the line without losing their saddle. You want to stay. You learn the iron. Is it our ranch?" Eli asked. He looked Caleb right in the buttonhole, the one where the brass was missing. "The man Crane said it belonged to the company now." Crane S. got a piece of paper. Caleb said, "The company's got a safe in Chicago, but the dirt belongs to the man who is holding the shovel when the cloudburst comes. I put 12 years of my life into these logs. Eli, I buried my father under that limestone bluff, and I didn't use no company money to buy the stone. If Harlan wants the land, he has got to take it from the ground up, not from a ledger." The boy was quiet for a long time. He looked down at his shoes, then back at the gray horse. "I can handle the gate tomorrow," he said. "The gate's down," Caleb said, mounting the bay. "We don't need the gate no more. We need the rifles. You go back to the house and tell your mother I'm riding the south fence line until dark. Tell her to keep the shutters barred if the dust starts to lift off the flats." He turned the bay toward the draw. He didn't look back to see if Eli was following, but as the horse trotted into the sage, he heard the sharp, regular plip-plop of Gerald's hooves behind him, moving at the exact same pace. The storm came from the west this time, not the south. It didn't bring no rain, just a wall of black dust that smelled of old sulfur and dried manure, blotting out the mountains until the world was only 10 paces wide. Caleb was in the old barn when the timber gave way. The wind hit the north wall with a sound like a cannon shot, lifting the sod roof right off the plate logs. A 12-foot rafter, green pine and heavy as an anvil, split down the grain and fell straight across Caleb's left shoulder, pinning him into the muck of the feeding alley. He didn't scream. There wasn't no air in his lungs to do it. The world went gray, then red, then black as a coal sack. When he opened his eyes, The dust was in his throat, thick as flour. He tried to roll onto his side, but his ribs grated like two stones in a hopper. His left arm was numb, the fingers cold where they lay in the straw. Caleb, the voice came through the roar of the wind, thin and sharp as a tin whistle. Margaret was in the alley. She had her wool shawl in her mouth, her eyes red from the grit. She didn't have no lantern. The wind would have blown the wick out before she cleared the kitchen stoop. She had the broadaxe in her hands. She dropped to her knees beside the log. "Stay still," she gasped, her face within 3 inches of his beard, the plate still shifting. "Get the lever," Caleb choked out. The blood was tasting salt in his mouth. Under the oats bin. The ash pole. She didn't look for the pole. She took the broadaxe and drove the blade right under the rafter where it met the mudsill. She didn't use her arms. She put her whole weight, all 90 pounds of her, onto the hickory handle, using the anvil block for a fulcrum. The log lifted 2 inches, just enough for Caleb to drag his leg out of the drift. He rolled onto his right side, his chest screaming as the broken ribs found the muscle. He got his back against the partition wall, his breath coming in short, rattling wheezes. Margaret dropped the axe. She sat down in the straw beside him, her hair completely loose now, gray with the trail dust that was sifting through the broken roof. "You re a fool," she said. Her voice was shaking, but her hands were steady as she tore a strip from her apron to wipe the blood off his chin. "You stayed out here to watch the horses when the roof was already groaning. A horse is $40. Caleb said, his head back against the pine timber. "A man can't buy another team if the barn goes down on them. A horse don't keep the stove hot," she said, her fingers tightening around his collar. "A horse don't teach the boy how to hold the line. You built this place like a fort, Caleb, but you forgot that a fort's just a cage if you re the only one inside holding the key." Caleb closed his eyes. The pain in his ribs was a steady, throbbing heat, but the cold from the ground was coming up through his trousers. "We had an agreement. Margaret, labor and upkeep. I don't ask you to pull the timber off me." The silence inside the barn got very thin then, despite the wind outside. Margaret stood up. She didn't use the axe to help herself. She just stood straight, her skirt covered in stable filth, her face looking like it was carved out of the limestone on the bluff. "The agreement is dead. Mercer," she said. Her voice had the same flat, tinned register it had when she first got off the stagecoach at Ridgeline. "You paid for my hands, and I gave them to you. But I didn't agree to watch a man die in the muck just so he could keep his heart clean of needing someone. You want a servant. You go back to the matrimonial paper. I'm going to the house to get the kids." She walked down the alley, the screen of dust closing behind her before she hit the door latch. She didn't leave that night. The wind was too high for the team, and the gray mule had gone lame in the hocks from the flying gravel for 3 days. The house was as quiet as a church cellar. Margaret did the cooking. She washed the plates. She mended Eli's shirt by the window, but she didn't look at the space between Caleb's eyebrows. When she passed him the bread, she set it on the table first, letting the wood take the weight before he could touch the tin. It was the old rule, the fatal one. He'd had driven it into the logs on their first night, and now she was living by it, perfectly, until the air inside the cabin felt like ice before a freeze. On Sunday evening, Eli came into the smithy. Caleb was sitting on the bench by the dead forge, his left arm bound tight to his ribs with a linen sheet. He had his pocket knife out, trying to scrape the rust off a harness buckle with one hand. The boy stood by the door frame, his hands in his pockets. "Mother's crying," he said. Caleb didn't stop the knife. Scrape, scrape. "She's thinking about the road." "She's not thinking about the road," Eli said. He walked over and stood right in front of the anvil, his face dark in the shadow of the chimney. "She's crying because you told her she was just the upkeep. She's crying the way she did when the marshal took the piano out of the parlor in St. Louis." Caleb laid the buckle down. The steel made a sharp, heavy clink against the iron anvil face. "A piano don't belong in the sagebrush." "Eli, it wasn't the piano," the boy said, his voice rising just an octave. "It was the fact that nobody asked her if she wanted to keep it. My dad just gave it away to pay for his tickets. And you're doing the same thing. You re-giving her away to keep your pastures. Caleb stood up. It took him a long time, his ribs pulling at the linen sheet until he had to catch his breath through his teeth. He walked across the dirt floor until he was looking down at the boy's nose. "You think I want Harlan to have this creek?" Caleb asked. "I don't know." Eli said, his eyes perfectly steady up against Caleb's shirt. "You don't say nothing. You just stay out here with the iron." Caleb didn't answer. He took his hat from the peg with his right hand, pulled it low until the brim touched his eyebrows, and walked across the yard to the house. The kitchen was dark except for the light from the stove door. Margaret was at the table, her hands flat on the white oilcloth, her head down. She didn't move when the latch clicked. Caleb sat down in the second chair, the one he'd bought from the traveling merchant that had stayed empty for 6 months. It made a dry, groaning sound under his weight. "I said the wrong thing," Caleb said. His voice was rough, like gravel shifting in a bucket after the rain. "In the barn. I said it because I was scared." Margaret didn't look up. Her fingers didn't move on the cloth. "A man like you don't get scared." "Caleb, I've been scared for 20 years, he said. He looked at the stove, where the red coals were dying down to gray ash. "My mother left when the wind was just like this. Slipped out the back while my father was fixing the corral gate. I spent 2 weeks waiting on that ridge, thinking every gray horse was her coming back with the wagon. I built this place so nothing could get out, Margaret, but I built it so nothing could get in. Neither." He reached his right hand across the table. His palm was black with charcoal, the skin rough as an old cedar shingle. "I don't want the eastern pastures without the children," he said, "and I don't want the kitchen without you. It ain't the agreement no more. It says the home. If you give me the time, I'll prove the line holds." Margaret Cole looked at his hand. She looked at his face, where the charcoal lines were mixed with the white lines of his old scars. Slowly, her fingers moved across the oilcloth until her wrist was under his thumb. Her skin was warm. It wasn't soft, she'd been scrubbing the lard pots for 3 weeks, but it felt solid, like the seasoned pine they used for the main sills. "The 15th is Friday, Caleb," she said. Her voice was very low, but the ice was gone out of it. "Harlan's going to bring the sheriff. Let him bring the county," Caleb said, his thumb closing around her wrist with a grip that driven the wood home. "We got the ledger, and we got the rifles. And for the first time in 12 years, Margaret, the door on this house is going to open from the inside, through the canvas partition." The little girl gave a short, quiet sigh in her sleep, her rag doll falling off the cot onto the floorboards. Neither of them picked it up. The dark was still out there on the flats, huge and cold and empty, but inside the log wall, the flame had finally caught the wood. The 15th of August didn't bring no clouds. The morning came on pale and thin, the color of a greasy nickel, before the sun hit the rimrock and turned the whole valley into an oven. Caleb sat on the porch bench, a small oilstone in his right hand. He was drawing the edge of his pocket knife down the gray rock, slow and regular. Whir slick, whir slick. His left arm was still bound to his ribs under his canvas coat, but he didn't lean against the logs. A man leaning is a man waiting to be pushed. You don't sharpen a blade by pressing hard, he said to Eli, who was sitting on the top step with his boots in the dust. You let the weight of the steel do the work against the grit. If you force it, you just create a wire edge. It looks sharp for one cut. Then it rolls over like soft lead the minute it hits a pine knot. A true edge takes patience. It says the same with a man. You find out what he's made of when the grinding gets slow. The boy didn't look back at the stone. He was looking at the dust cloud rising over the south ridge. "They are coming," he said. 2 rigs. A light buggy in the lead, the livery horse lathered gray around the flanks, and Sheriff Dunbar riding behind on his big claybank gelding. Wade Harlan sat in the buggy seat, his white hat clean, his hands holding the leather reins with the short, tight grip of a man who owned the livery bills. Victor Crane sat beside him, the black leather ledger tucked under his elbow like a parson Bible. They pulled up 15 feet from the stoop. The claybank horse blew through its nose, its big hooves stamping the dry alfalfa until the white dust rose around Dunbar's stirrups. The sheriff didn't get down. He touched the brim of his hat to Margaret, who had come out to stand behind Caleb's right shoulder. She had her dark hair braided tight, her gray wool dress clean, her hands folded over the white apron. "Mercer," Dunbar said. His voice was low, carried on the thin air like a dry leaf. "It's noon." Wade Harlan stepped out of the buggy. His boots were fine leather and shiny, but the alkali caught the grease along the seams anyway. He didn't look at Caleb. He looked at the square pine timbers of the house, his eyes measuring the joints. "We have the writ, Caleb," Harlan said. He reached out and took the blue paper from Crane's hand. "The $1,840 hasn't been deposited at the county seat. The Chugwater quarter reverts to the syndicate today. We're here to sign the deed transfer for the pastures." Caleb didn't stand up. He kept his thumb on the bolster of his knife. "The note is fraud." Harlan, Crane stepped out next. His bowler hat tilted back to keep the sun off his nose. "The note bears the legal signature of Thomas Cole, Mr. Mercer, certified by the Circuit Court of Missouri. There is no fraud in a signature. A signature is just ink," Margaret said. She stepped to the edge of the porch, her small shoes coming right to the lip of the top board. She didn't look at Crane. She looked at Wade Harlan. She pulled a thin sheaf of blue papers from her apron pocket, the ones she'd taken from the flat tin box under the iron cot. "My husband didn't borrow that money from Chicago, Mr. Harlan," she said, her voice clear as a bell in the quiet drawl. "He took it from the Regional Railroad Fund when he was the clerk in Laramie 6 years ago. Your name is on the secondary ledger as the bondsman. You didn't buy this note to clear the syndicate's credit. You bought it because if the Chicago auditors looked too close at Thomas' books, they did have found your signature on the vouchers for the timberland you stole from the territory." Harlan's hand went to his waistcoat pocket, his fingers tensing against the gold watch chain. His face didn't turn red. It turned gray, the color of dry alkali. "That city talk. Woman, a dead man's word don't stand in a Wyoming court." "It ain't his word," Caleb said, standing up now. He did it slow, his ribs pulling at the linen sheet under his coat. But he stood straight. "It's the state land ledger. I sent Dot Pierce into the land office at Cheyenne on Tuesday morning with the bay horse. She had the numbers Margaret found in my record box. The Territory Supreme Court issued a stay on the writ 3 hours ago. Harlan, Sheriff Dunbar's got it in his pocket right now. He just wanted to see if you'd try to sign the deed before he showed it to you." Harlan turned his head slowly toward the Claybank horse. Sheriff Dunbar reached into his vest, pulled out a long, yellow envelope with the governor's seal, and dropped it into the dust by Harlan's shiny boots. The ink changed. "Wade," Dunbar said quietly, "the stay says the Chugwater line stays where the cottonwood stump was until the federal surveyor comes out in September. You take your wire off Caleb Springs before sundown, or I'll have the marshal out from Laramie for timber fraud. You're too old for the territorial prison. Harlan, the air in the cells don't suit a man with bad lungs." Crane looked at the yellow envelope in the dirt. He didn't pick it up. He climbed back into the buggy seat, pulled his bowler down over his ears, and took the whip out of the socket. "The syndicate will review the regional accounts, Mr. Harlan," the clerk said, his voice high and thin. "We don't tolerate irregularity in the vouchers." Harlan stood in the sun for 20 seconds, his white hat casting a dark shadow over his mouth. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Margaret. Then he reached down, picked up the yellow paper from the dust, and climbed into the rig beside Crane without another word. The buggy turned so fast the iron tire scraped the paint off the sideboard, the livery horse galloping down the trail toward the ridge until the dice dust took them both. Dunbar stayed on his horse. He looked at Eli, then at the little girl, Rose, who was sitting on the woodbox with her rag doll. "You got a good lawyer, Caleb," the sheriff said, his mustache twitching at the corner. "Even if he is in the cemetery, I got a good wife." "Cole," Caleb said. Dunbar nodded once, touched his hat to Margaret, and wheeled the Claybank toward the town road, his pony trotting steady through the sage. The sun went down behind the freeze-out ridge at 6 o'clock, leaving the sky the color of a wild rose against the black pine timber. Caleb sat on the porch, his boots off, his socks getting gray with the dust that came up through the floorboards. The ribs were still sore, but they didn't pull when he took his breath. Margaret came out with the coffee pot. She didn't use the tin cups tonight. She brought 2 porcelain mugs she'd kept wrapped in her winter cloak since St. Louis. They had small blue flowers painted on the rims, the handles thin as bird bones. She set his mug on the bench beside him. The boy wants to know if he can feed Gerald his grain tonight. Tell him 2 quarts, Caleb said, taking the porcelain handle in his thick, scarred fingers no more. A horse that gets too much corn when the weather's dry gets the founder in his hocks. His feet turn soft, and then you re-riding a beast that's walking on needles. You have to measure the feed by the work the horse done. That's the rule. Margaret sat beside him. Her skirt rustled against his canvas coat, the wool warm against his knee. She didn't look at the road. She looked at the creek bed where the water was beginning to rise again after the cloudburst. A thin silver thread through the willows. Thomas used to say that everything could be settled with a speech, she said softly. He spent his whole life talking. Caleb, he talked the bank into the loan. He talked the neighbors into the partnership. And he talked me into thinking the brick house would always be there. But when the wind came, the words just blew away like the chaff from the thresher. Caleb took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, black and sweet with the brown sugar she'd cleaned the ants out of. Out here, Margaret, he said, the words don't count for nothing unless they got a fence post behind them. A man can say he's your friend, but if he don't show up with the spade when your ditch breaks, his talk is just noise in the brush. I didn't have no beautiful things to say to you when you got off that stagecoach. No, she said, her head dropping onto his shoulder, her hair smelling of the rye bread she'd baked for supper. You told me the house creaked and the well was low. That was the most comforting thing I ever heard, Mr. Mercer. It meant the floor was solid enough to hold the truth. Caleb put his right arm around her waist. His hand went into the fold of her apron, his fingers finding her wrist where the pulse was steady, beating hard and regular against his thumb. The little girl came out of the kitchen, her bare feet making a soft, pattering sound on the pine planks. She didn't have the rag doll by the arm anymore. She was holding it by the waist, the new porcelain doll Caleb had brought from Herschel S. tucked under her other arm. She looked at Caleb's boots. The new sister don't have a name yet, Rose said. Caleb looked down at the little girl's nose. Ask your mother, he said, his voice dropping into that low, flat register that sounded like the wind in the pines. She's the one who handles the names in this house. I just handle the timber. Her name is Sarah, Margaret said, reaching down to take the girl's small hand. After the woman who built the first cabin on this creek. Was she lonely? Rose asked. She was until she started the garden, Margaret said. Go on inside and help Eli with the woodbox. The dark's coming up from the bottoms. The child went in, the screen door clicking shut behind her with that old, familiar iron sound. The stars came out over the big horns, small and sharp as diamond points in the deep blue vault. The air was turning cold now, the mountain winter sending its first scout down into the sagebrush draws before the August moon could turn full. Caleb looked at the second chair across the table through the cabin window. The yellow light from the lamp was hitting the ash backrest, making the grain look dark and deep as river water. It wasn't an empty chair anymore. It had a place at the board, and the wood was holding the weight. He thought about his old rule, the lonely one he'd carved out of the newspaper 3 weeks before the stagecoach brought them. He'd built his life like a lime cabin, tight and small, with just enough room for one man to keep his boots dry. He'd thought that was safety. But as he looked at the dark swells of the hills where his cattle were resting safe above the wire, he knew the country had beaten his rule anyway. It had broken his barn. It had nicked his axe. And it had forced him to open his gate to a woman who knew how to balance a ledger with her bare hands. And as he pressed his thumb against Margaret's wrist in the dark, Caleb Mercer knew that losing that old safety was the only thing that had ever truly saved his life. Caleb, she whispered in the shadow of the porch roof. Yeah, the coffee's getting cold. He smiled into the dark, the muscle in his cheek loose now, the hard line of his mouth giving way to the warmth of her hair against his chin. Then let's go inside, he said, standing up and taking her hand in his. The stove is hot, and the wood's driven home. They went through the door together, and the latch clicked behind them, solid and sure as the territory itself.
Welcome to a powerful Western story about cowboys, frontier love, a mother's sacrifice, human kindness, and the healing power of compassion in a hard land. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations. And so, as the door of that old log cabin closed behind Caleb, Margaret, Eli, and little Rose, the story did not truly end. Out there beyond the porch, the Wyoming wind was still waiting. The mountains were still cold. The cattle still needed water. The fences still needed mending. And the land would still test every soul who dared to call it home. But something inside that cabin had changed. Forever. When Caleb Mercer first wrote his letter, he believed he was asking for help with chores, meals, laundry, and survival. He thought a woman's hands could make the work lighter, but he never imagined that a woman's courage could make his heart whole again. Margaret Cole came to Broken Spur Ranch not searching for romance, but for shelter. She was a mother running from debt, humiliation, and the kind of polished cruelty that hides behind legal papers and clean city shoes. She did not arrive with dreams of love. She arrived with 2 hungry children, a hidden fear, and just enough strength left to keep moving. Yet in that harsh country, where every nail, every fence post, every bucket of water had to prove its worth, Margaret proved something greater than survival. She proved that dignity can still stand tall in worn shoes, that a mother's love can cross 700 miles of dust, and that a broken past does not have the final right to name a person's future. Caleb's old rule had kept him alive, but it had also kept him locked away from the very thing that could save him. He believed that needing someone was weakness, because once, long ago, someone he needed had left. So he built his life like a fortress, strong enough to withstand wind, hunger, and winter, but too narrow to hold love. That is one of the deepest truths this story leaves us with. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very prison that keeps us lonely. Caleb had cattle, land, tools, and a roof over his head. But until Margaret and the children came, his house had only one heartbeat. That empty chair at his table was not just furniture. It was the shape of everything he had refused to admit he wanted. And when that chair finally became a place for another life, another voice, another soul, Caleb discovered that a home is not made by log, stone, or law. A home is made when people choose to stay, choose to fight, and choose to carry one another when the storm becomes too heavy for one pair of shoulders. This story reminds us that real love is not always born in sieved words or candlelit promises. Sometimes love begins as duty. Sometimes it is hidden in a repaired gate, a shared ledger, a bucket carried from the spring, or a hand reaching across a table after years of silence. Caleb did not win Margaret's heart with poetry. He won it by standing beside her when the law came riding up the road. Margaret did not heal Caleb with pretty speeches. She healed him by refusing to let him die alone in the mud, by telling him the truth when his pride had made him blind, and by showing him that strength does not mean never needing anyone. Strength means knowing who is worth needing. And the children, Eli and Rose, remind us that the wounds of adults are never carried by adults alone. A child watches everything. A child remembers who leaves, who stays, who speaks harshly, and who shows up when the roof begins to fall. For Eli, Caleb became more than a hard man with a ranch. He became proof that not every man disappears in the night. For Rose, that cabin became more than a strange, creaking house in a wild land. It became a place where the dark could be explained, where the logs groaned because they were holding, and where a new doll could finally have a name. The lesson of Broken Spur Ranch is not that hardship disappears when people love each other. The lesson is that hardship becomes bearable when it is shared. The wind still blows. The deaths still come. The greedy still reach for what does not belong to them. But when good people stand together, when truth is placed on the table, when courage is driven deep like a fence post in